You're listening to the Common Descent Podcast. Hello, Will.
Hey, David.
And hello, listeners. And welcome to a very special episode 19 of the Common Descent Podcast.
Indeed.
How does 19 work for you?
How does 19? This so far works pretty well.
Works pretty well. Today, we are... So, hey, you remember how sometimes we have episodes where we take special requests from our listeners?
Oh, I do remember that.
And then also, you remember how a couple times we've had episodes where we've had special guests on the podcast?
That has happened as well.
This is the first episode where we are doing both.
Collective gasp from the audience.
I heard it. I heard it around the world in the future. Today's episode topic comes requested to us by Matthew on Facebook, who asked if we could do an episode about women in paleontology.
Yeah.
Which is an awesome suggestion.
It really is.
But that is not the typical sort of science-y, kind of topic that we normally do. And so, fortunately, we knew someone who could help us out.
Yeah.
In fact, you know how we always do topics and we're like, could be a whole podcast about this sort of topic.
Yeah.
Well, there is. And we got that podcast host to join us today. For this episode, we are going to be joined by Michelle Barboza-Ramirez of the Femmes of STEM podcast, who is all about the role of women in various fields of science, and Michelle herself is a paleontologist.
Pretty perfect matchup.
Yes, so more on that. A whole wonderful discussion coming up with Michelle after the news. But before the news, a couple things to get out of the way.
Announcements.
A few announcements. We'll make them real quick. It is October here on Earth, and that is a great time to remind everybody that October's run of Common Descent podcast episodes are brought to you pretty much entirely by the donations from our subscribers on Patreon.
It's pretty sweet.
Big thank you to all of our patrons. We are making enough money to cover the costs of producing and hosting the podcast every month, and even a little bit more, which means that we can start saving up to hopefully use this money to do more cool things in the future to improve the podcast. If you would like to join us on Patreon, we would be super happy to have you. You can donate whatever you want. Donors on Patreon get some special access to behind-the-scenes posts, bonus audio recordings, and if you subscribe at a certain level, you get to have your name shouted out on the podcast, which brings me to some new patrons.
Yeah.
Michael subscribed in between our recordings of episode 18A and 18B, and we shouted out to him at the beginning of 18B, which was kind of in the middle of an episode. So, in fairness to Michael, here's his beginning of the episode shout-out. Thank you for joining us. And more recently, Demi has become a patron on Patreon.
Yeah.
Thank you both to Michael and Demi for joining us.
Thanks, guys.
And, of course, thank you to everybody else who listens, who is on Patreon, who is not on Patreon, Facebook, Twitter, iTunes reviews, all that stuff. We love hearing from you and getting your feedback.
You guys are pretty awesome.
Speaking of that, at the end of the last episode, we had a conversation about ape sex.
Yeah. Yes, we did.
Which caught the attention of a few of our listeners who have since... Yeah, for some reason, I don't know what. They really like apes. We have actually... It's funny, it was a bit of a tangential, unplanned conversation.
Yeah.
So naturally, we left stuff out. And we've had a few of our listeners pitch in additional info.
Yeah, fill in those gaps.
Yeah, we've put some of the things that our listeners have thrown our direction, basically filling in some of the extra information that we didn't get to talk about on the podcast. Those are on Facebook and Twitter. We've shared them, so you can check those out. Big thanks to Darcy on Twitter, who is a longtime follower, and a new listener, it sounds like, whose name is spelled Jens, but might not be pronounced Jens.
Mm-hmm.
So apologies to, I'm going to call him Mr. K. What's up, Mr. K? Thanks for sending us some extra information.
Yeah.
We shared
they both
that.
were really helpful. Darcy actually answered one of the questions we had while having the discussion.
Yes.
When it came to the cultural prevalence of kissing.
Yes.
Which is really nice.
So thank you to all of those people. One final note, this episode is going to be coming out the second week of October, actually just a few days before National Fossil Day.
Woo!
So it is our duty as paleontologists and educators to tell everybody that if there's a museum or a university or something nearby you and you're interested, check it out. They might be doing something special for National Fossil Day.
We're even doing something cool for it at the aquarium. For the
Sweet.
Saturday after it, we'll be having one of the local fossil club here bring in a bunch of different material that coincides with a lot of our animals and talk about them.
Very cool. Check that out. If you find something cool, let us know. Let us know what you did for National Fossil Day. We will be excited to hear about it.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's all the announcements. Eventually, we're going to have to just do a whole extra episode for announcements.
All right.
It's getting crazy, which is
have
awesome.
to have the bi-weekly newsletter.
Yes. So, let's move on to the news. In honor of our episode topic today, all of the news stories we're going to be presenting in paleontology/evolution/fossil news are studies led or primarily authored by female paleontologists.
Yeah.
Because, as we will discuss in our conversation after the news, representation is important.
Yes.
There are wonderful women doing wonderful work in paleontology. And funnily enough, that's a limiter, right? We set a limit on what an extra criterion for choosing our news this episode. And in the back of my head, I was wondering how that was going to affect availability. Like, are we going to have to dig a little deeper than usual? Are we going to have to go back a little farther in time? Maybe talk about some topics that we don't usually talk about? Turns out, no.
Nope.
Not even a little bit.
Didn't really affect at all.
Did not affect. These are the things we probably would have wanted to talk about anyway.
Yeah.
So
No.
Not even a limiting factor, which is really, really awesome.
Yes.
Go ahead, start us off, Will.
And so, for my first news article, I want to talk about kitties.
Kitties?
Specifically, kittens.
Sully from Monsters, Inc.
Yes. Yeah, kitty. Specifically, I'm talking about the kittens of a certain saber-toothed cat. So a fairly recent study by Catherine Long, who's actually a master's student, and it's published on PLOS ONE. She, along with her advisor and a couple other people on the article or on the paper, was asking the question, what were saber-toothed cat kittens actually like? And how did they grow?
Yeah.
Now, this is over in California where they have La Brea tar pits, which is chock-a-block full of a particular saber-toothed cat known as Smilodon fatalis, which is the famous one. This is what you're thinking of typically when you think of saber-toothed cats.
Yeah, right now it's the image in your head.
It's the image. So Smilodons are very, very well known from there, and the adults are incredibly well studied, but not so much the kittens. And they do have juveniles there. They have a variety of ages, and they decided they wanted to know how they grew because Smilodon is famous not just for having those big teeth, but also being a very robust cat.
Yeah, they're beefy.
They're like bulldogish. They've got a wide, broad chest. They've got stout, shorter limbs. So they're not long and slinky like your house cat. They're very tough and thick, for a cat at least.
Yeah.
So they were wondering, is that something that develops with age, or did that feature show up in the young as well? One of the other things I liked about this study is that they decided to find this out by using a study that had already been done recently on modern cats, looking at the growth history of different cats.
Oh.
And so basically, using the parameters already and the info already set up by that study, they just studied the bones. They just looked at and analyzed the bones of different age juveniles of Smilodon and plugged it in.
Cool.
And what they found is they were born beefy.
That's cool.
So by measuring the lengths and circumferences of the juvenile limb bones, they found that they started out pretty beefy, but besides that followed the exact same growth patterns as modern cats.
Interesting. So they didn't grow any differently. They just
Yeah. They were still getting proportionally longer and more slender and gracile as they grew, but were still relatively beefy from birth, so they were still beefy when they were older.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I wonder what that means for playtime.
Just these little boulders running around with teeth.
Just wrestling each other with their giant saber-tooth arms.
It's cool. They said the next step in their study would look at interior growth to get
Okay.
look at the
within
inside
the bone.
either,
You mean?
Yeah, inside the bone, exactly. To do a CT scans or X-rays to look inside the bone and look at the marrow versus solid bone, which would be the weight-bearing factor. Because right now their studies are treating the bone as a solid shaft, which throws off weight estimates or weight studies.
Right.
That would,
because it's not.
Exactly, that would take weight differently than the marrow-filled, slightly hollow bones of an actual mammal.
Yeah.
And that would give them better looks at what the body was actually, how it was actually functioning with the bones that they have.
Very cool. It's always fun to learn about how extinct animals grew.
Yeah, it can tell you a lot about their potential behavior or, functionings throughout life.
Yeah. A quick note that I thought was really interesting. Darren Naish on Twitter pointed out that he does not like calling saber-tooth cat young kittens and that they should be cubs.
Interesting.
Which, at first I was like, well, you could... No, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Because we call all the other big cats are cubs.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Tiger cubs, lion cubs.
I did wonder when I first read it and saw kittens, I was like, I think that's the first time I've ever heard it called a kitten. So yeah, cubs make sense.
Now, in their defense, and I think that was in the actual study, it wasn't just a news thing, I think it was in the actual study, kittens sounds cooler.
Yeah.
It sounds more alluring, and it gets more attention. So, I understand the allure.
Naming of juveniles, and I've had this conversation with guests before and other people at the aquarium, naming of juveniles is always funny to me. Because, yes, there is a little bit of if I say kitten or pup, you immediately know what animal I'm talking about. But once again, it's just a different way for me to say baby.
Yeah, it's the ssame.
And why do bears and lions both get to have the same name for their babies?
Wolves do, too.
Well,
all across carnivora.
It's one of those things where, there's definitely, dolphin babies are called calves, and that has led other people argue whether they should be... Yeah.
They're artiodactyls.
Which has made other people wonder, should they really be pods or herds? The naming of groups and babies is something that is fun, and that's really where it should end. For me personally, is it's fun, but it gets complicated quick when you start trying to nitpick it.
That being said, the next news article is also about studying growth over the life of an animal, particularly this time in, I'm going to go ahead and say Triceratops chicks. So this is a study. This is an interesting one because it's actually not a finished study. This is a bit of beginning research that I actually wrote about this week, and there was a press release that went out about it. So there's not a study associated with this yet, which is actually kind of cool to see the very beginnings, the planning of a new approach. The story here starts with 2 pieces of young Triceratops skulls going under a CT scanner to study their brains. This is work being done by Ashley Morhart from Washington University in St. Louis, along with her colleagues. What they're doing is by plugging the skulls, and these aren't full Triceratops skulls, these are the brain cases. Right, the skull has all sorts of different parts, and human skulls are not a great example of this, because our skull is almost entirely brain case. But if you look at a Triceratops or most animals, they've got the jaws and the nose, and the Triceratops has that frill. But just behind the eyes is a bunch of bones that encapsulate the brain. And when you have a nice, complete brain case, what you can do, and what they're doing, is CT scanning it, medical, right, CT scanner, to create a digital image of it so that they can virtually fill in the space within the brain case and create a model of the shape of the brain tissue. This is called an endocast, since you're treating the brain case like a mold and you're casting the brain shape within it. You don't get an exact shape of the brain, since the brain, especially in animals like dinosaurs, doesn't completely fill the space, but it can give you insight into where the different brain regions are, the size and shape of the different brain regions, and, even more impressively, you can look at all the little channels and holes and divots where the nerves and blood vessels run, and by comparing those to the structures we see in modern birds and crocodilians, you can then get a really good approximate of what the dinosaurs' brain looked like. And this has been done for a lot of different dinosaurs, right? T-Rex has been done for, and that's how we know that it had a great big olfactory region and a good sense of smell. You can learn about, the balance and coordination structures by looking at things like the inner ear within the brain case. All sorts of different things you can learn by looking at the shape of the skull bones around the brain. What these researchers are aiming to do particularly is look at brain ontogeny. So how did the brain case and perhaps the brain structure of Triceratops change over the course of its life? Because as Dr. Morhart explained to me when I spoke to her, we know a lot about Triceratops ontogeny. We have a lot of juveniles and a lot of adults, all different ages. So we know a ton about how their face shape changes and their frill changes, but we don't know hardly anything about how their brain case changed as they grew. And that can tell us all sorts of stuff about behavioral shifts, or how the facial shape is related to the shape of the brain, right? As the brain shape changes, the skull shape changes. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff they're hoping to learn by studying how this changes ontogenetically.
That's a really cool study. I love looking at those things because I think a lot of people don't realize, with our brain, it just kind of looks like a big fruit.
A big melon head.
But a big melon, like that's what we call it, our melon.
This guy's got his melon stuck.
Yeah, it's huge. But other animals
have one stuck melon.
Other animals have very distinctly shaped brains for the job it's doing, where the part for smell is big, or the part for sight is big, and memory, sections will be bigger or smaller, and you can act like it's very much more telling. They're shaped much more like
it can be
like a duck bill for a lot of animals than it is for us.
Yeah.
Which means with dinosaurs, if you can get a shape of it, you might be able to learn things. Like that's why we think T-Rex had a really good sense of smell.
Yes.
Which is cool.
Indeed. And in fact, there was a study that has recently been. There's one other study that Dr. Morhart showed me about dinosaur brain ontogeny, which was in an iguanodontian, I think, where they found that the brain, most of the regions of the brain were pretty well formed in the juvenile, which is potentially an indication that they were very independent and self-sufficient, that they already were well coordinated and their sensory systems were all basically up and running.
Getting up and running like deer do and other animals.
Yeah. But then that there was a change in the brain shape around sexual maturity.
Oh, that's cool.
Which could be relating to, different patterns of behavior that are showing up, either, sexual behavior, like mating and finding a mate and such, or, changing in lifestyle. Like you're older and now you're feeding on different things.
Dino puberty.
Living a different place. Yeah, exactly. Dino puberty happens in the brain. So who knows what we're going to learn about Triceratops. It's going to be very exciting.
It's pretty awesome. So my final study has a little bit to do with dinosaur behavior directly, and specifically diet. So, study by Karen Chin et al. In Scientific Reports is on some fecal matter from large herbivorous dinosaurs. Fecal matter that we would call coprolites when it's fossilized like this.
Yes, fossil poo.
It is pretty sweet. So, dinosaur poo is pretty rare to find in general, especially herbivore droppings, because they tend to break down pretty quickly. If the article gave, or the news article gave the example of thinking of like cow pies and cow patties.
Yeah.
Is a lot of plant material. It's going to break down pretty quickly because it's already been digested, becomes fertilizer, so on and so forth. We do get carnivorous coprolites a bit more often because there's usually more mineral in it from the bones of the animals they're eating.
Yeah.
Which makes it a little more substantial. But they found some from herbivores, and they found something really cool by looking inside them. Mm-hmm. So we get indications of dinosaur diets a few ways. Most obvious is the teeth, sharp teeth, meat, flatter teeth or grinding teeth for plants, and the multitude of varieties within all of those teeth.
Yeah.
The other way is either finding stuff in the gut of the fossil or in the poop, which is kind of the holy grail version because this is actually show what went through their digestive system.
Yeah.
And in this one, they found rotten wood and exoskeleton pieces from most likely crustaceans.
Neither of those things is what you would expect to find going through the gut of an herbivore.
So these are weird things. Now, Karen Chin had found rotten log material before. So this is not the first time that's been found. The crustacean pieces are the thing that's really new and interesting here. And what they think this might suggest is that the dinosaur, which she thinks is most likely hadrosaurs, were going after rotten logs and going for the crabs or crayfish or other cousins of those animals that are hiding in among the now rotten wood, either eating the wood or eating the other things in there.
Yeah.
And actively going after that, eating these things would boost their calcium intake and protein intake for the meat and shell of the crustaceans. The fungus in the wood could also increase protein in their diet.
Interesting.
And they attributed this to something we see in modern birds that are mainly herbivores today, will also take insects in their diet, specifically when they're getting ready to lay eggs.
Oh, for extra material.
Extra material.
Egg building material and protein.
Exactly.
And such.
You require more insects to make these eggs. And
yes. Very nice.
And they think maybe that's what the dinosaurs were doing. That this wasn't a regular, that they didn't just hunt rotten logs, but that they would do it to supplement their diet in certain times. It's also been suggested that this could be a result from environmental upheaval. If the climate was changing or your food was particularly hard to find, then this might be a suitable stand-in or something that they could go for when they particularly need it.
That's super interesting because it's one of those discoveries that is fun to discover, and it's a surprise that we found it, but it's not a surprise that it exists.
Yes.
Because categories like herbivore and carnivore, like so many categories in nature, are not... Tons of examples of herbivores turning to animals for additional protein.
Yeah. We see that with a number of herbivores today. There's the famous things of deers murdering ground nesting birds to eat the wings off of chicks or go after the eggs. And I know it's been seen in cattle. Our friend Ethan, when he worked at the Knoxville Zoo, said that the red pandas, who are typically bamboo eaters, would gladly grab a lizard if it ran by. Stuff like that.
Yeah. You take your nutrients where you can get them.
Absolutely. And it's something I always love to tell people on the tours at the aquarium whenever we're talking about the habits of an animal is we write books about them. The animals do not read those books we write. So they don't have to follow those rules. That's just us saying what we're pretty sure they do. So they may do weird stuff.
Because animals are special. Hadrosaurs are super specialized in most cases for eating plants in ways that other animals could not have accomplished. but that doesn't mean that their diet was 100% plants.
Yeah.
And it's not unusual, like you said, for animals to supplement their diet with other things. It's really cool here that they're basically just chowing down on rotten logs to scoop up all the snacks inside.
Well, I wonder if it's a lot like modern day elephants will go to salt infused caves and chisel off chunks with their tusk to get, to supplement their salt diet, and like tapirs with the clay in the bottom of rivers. Like, I wonder if this is like that, where they're like, oh, I running low on calcium, where's a log? And
chomp down on a log.
Chomping down on it just from time to time like vitamins.
It's interesting because Karen Chin was actually on a recent episode of Science Friday talking about this. And we couldn't get her on the podcast. She was very busy. She couldn't come to talk to us about her news. And she made the point that we know that eating rotten logs full of little bugs was not their main diet because you can't sustain on that.
Yeah.
Rotting logs are a lot harder to find than living plants.
Yep.
So this would have had to have been a supplemental portion of their diet.
An active choice for one reason or another.
You can learn a whole lot from fossil poo.
Yeah.
And that Karen Chin really knows her stuff.
Yeah, to quote one of my favorite professors in college in biology, B.K. Hull, she would say, biology is all about sex and poop. And considering that both of these things have come up in the first 30 minutes of this episode, I'd say she's pretty darn right.
There you go. Speaking of digestive systems, the last article we're going to talk about comes to us from a study also in PLOS ONE by Melanie Hopkins and colleagues. Melanie Hopkins is at the Museum of Natural History in New York City, actually.
Oh, cool.
They looked at trilobites. Boy, there's not enough of that on this podcast. Trilobites from a Burgess Shale type locality in China that preserve some of the oldest known stomachs.
Cool.
Kind of.
Mm-hmm.
So let's explain. There's actually a bunch of... So trilobites are... remember in a cephalopods episode where we talked about how there's a bajillion of them because they're hard-shelled and they're super abundant in the fossil record? Trilobites are like that, but more.
Mm-hmm.
There are apparently... I learned this while reading about this article. This paper, I should say. There are almost 20,000 known species of trilobites. Of those, a handful have been discovered, preserved well enough for us to get a glimpse at their digestive system. And typically we see one of two shapes. Either the tube of the digestive tract has little glands on the sides, presumably feeding digestive juices into the tract, or an expanded portion at the front, which is called a crop, and is kind of analogous to our stomach, that the food goes into it and then through the rest of the tube. These trilobites, which are about 514 million years old, from Yunnan, China, the Guangshan biota, they found about 50 trilobites of two different species that have preserved digestive tissue, the soft tissue inside, and they found examples of both of those structures, which includes not only the oldest example of that stomach setup, that crop leading into the tube, but a definitive example of both the side digestive glands and the crop in the same trilobite.
Which is pretty awesome.
Which is really cool because it suggests that it wasn't just a clean split down the middle that some had one and some had the other. There were at least some early trilobites that had both. It also, because some people had also suggested that maybe the crop setup, that stomach leading into the tube system, didn't evolve until later, and that's why we don't see it until a little bit later.
Yeah.
This contradicts that. This says that structure was an early digestive system structure in trilobites.
Which is a perfect example of one of those times where discovering something leads to a far larger number of questions.
Yes, it does.
This is a really cool discovery.
Basically, I really like this one. Number one, it tells us that trilobite early evolution was a bit more complex than we had inferred. It tells us that the digestive system diversity in trilobites was also more diverse, more various. And it's preservation of trilobite stomachs, which is just super, super cool.
Yeah, and I love, much like we made the point of in the Cambrian explosion episode, when we got to the subject of eyes, is when you started saying this by saying one of the first stomachs.
Yes.
This is the invention of the stomach.
Yes. These were some of the first ever organisms to have a stomach.
Which is crazy.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Well, there you have it. And that's the way the news goes. With the news out of the way, we are ready to move on to our main topic of the episode. The rest of this episode will be our conversation with Michelle from the Femmes of STEM podcast talking about women in paleontology. We are going to talk about some of the particular challenges and situations that women experience in this and other fields of science.
Both past and present.
Past and present. We're going to talk about some famous historical figures in the field. And we're going to talk a bit about what the situation is and how all of us, even those of us who do not identify as women, fit into this broad topic.
Yeah.
So without further ado, take it away, us, in our conversation with Michelle. Hi, Michelle.
Heya.
Hey.
Thank you for being here on the podcast today.
Thanks for inviting me on, guys. I'm super stoked.
Yeah.
Yes, we are super stoked to have you with us. So before we get into our topic of discussion, would you like to introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. Hey, listeners. My name is Michelle Barboza-Ramirez, and I am a graduate student at the University of Florida in the Florida Museum of Natural History. I'm currently working towards my master's in science in vertebrate paleontology, but I'm also in a joint program where I'm working in the Women's Studies Department at the University of Florida. And the reason I'm doing that is because I guess about a year ago I had this idea to start a history podcast about the history of women in STEM fields, including women in paleontology, and that's kind of what got me onto this show today.
Yes,
Cool.
I was familiar with Michelle, partly by reputation and also partly because I've listened to Femmes of STEM.
My reputation
highly recommend
precedes me, does it?
Yes, and I promise it's all good things. So today's topic is women in paleontology, and as we're getting into it, right, the whole reason that we can do an episode about women in paleontology is because there are experiences that women face in the field that are unique to them. So, Michelle, can you start us off by just talking a little bit about what it means to be a woman in paleontology?
Sure. And I would say experiences not just in the field as in like out in the dirt and the rocks, but in the field as in, which I think now that I'm speaking in circles, I realize you meant the field of science and like paleontology.
Yes.
Wow. Okay. No, I get what you're saying.
It's a good distinction to make. It's not just the field, but the research, the publication, the classroom, so on and so forth.
Everything, the field and the history and that's why I'm here. So, well, I guess let me start by saying that every woman in STEM and any minority in any field really has these little stories that they could tell you. Something like being told by a mentor to make sure to wear a wedding ring to a job interview, or being told specifically to not wear a wedding ring to a job interview, or being asked to take notes at a meeting, and then being asked to take notes at a separate meeting, and then being asked to take notes at another one, or being asked to plan the work socials, or take on these extra little duties that maybe by themselves don't seem like such a big deal, but when you kind of put them together, they start to drag. And really that's what the issue is with all of these little stories. Each person, when they're encountering these issues, may not be sure what to make of this occurrence. You know, is it worth mentioning? Is it random? Maybe it's nothing. But maybe when you start listening to all these stories from all these people put together, it starts to sound like the symptom of a much bigger issue. And in this case, the issue is sexism and discrimination, which is still well and alive in the workplace. Now, a lot of people would be kind of surprised by that, I guess, assertion that I'm making, that sexism and discrimination is still alive in the workplace. Because, you know, it's clearly not okay anymore to say, oh, you are a woman, you cannot be a paleontologist, right? There's this overt sexism, no longer okay. We've made that much progress. But that means now that the sexism that women are facing is a much more subtle, even insidious kind of sexism, because no longer can we point to this easy target where it's like, he said I'm a lady and I can't do it. Now it's a thing that you almost have to like gather your facts and your evidence and document all these little occurrences so that you can have a solid case. And that is really tiring. And that is really hard. And that puts the burden of proof once again on the women or the minorities or whoever is being whoever is having to face these kinds of issues.
It's almost like dealing with a conspiracy theory of you're having to try to convince everyone else that this thing's actually happening.
Yes, that's a pretty good comparison.
Yeah.
But luckily
You're
we
all
have
Mulder.
had some people who are actually putting all these experiences together, not just, on blog posts, but actually publishing research, because of course we are scientists, so we want to see the data and the facts, and not until we see that will we be swayed. So fine, we've got that for you too. I brought a couple of studies that I thought would be useful to mention here, and these studies are actually particularly aimed, because there's a ton of studies about women in STEM and sexism, this and that, but these are specifically for women in earth sciences. So getting a little bit closer into what we're talking about. There was one study that was published just this year in Nature that analyzed gender bias in peer review. So that's like our bread and butter as researchers, right? Publishing papers, reviewing papers, being part of the scientific community in terms of that publication. And so the authors of this study analyzed both the genders and the ages of authors and reviewers from 2012 to 2015 for the journals of AGU, the American Geophysical Union. And what they found was that women were used less as reviewers, not just overall, but even when they compared it to the proportion of men to women as members of the society and as published authors of the journal. So they did kind of even things out and try to even out those ratios, and it still was not fitting what you would expect to see, or what you should see, I guess. Maybe you did expect this. And so
what you would like to see.
Right, what we would like to see, what we should be seeing. And so when the authors kind of went into why might there be this bias, what's going on here, what they found or what they suggested was that authors and editors are suggesting women as reviewers less often than they're suggesting men. And authors and editors include both men and women. Okay, so we're not just saying, hey, men are the only people that can be sexist, and this is a thing that affects everyone and that everyone might be contributing to. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later in my next study. Unconscious bias is a really big keyword that we're going to be coming back to. A lot of the sexism that we're seeing today, maybe it's not a completely deliberate person thinking, once again, you are a woman, you can't do this, but they've been conditioned since they were young to see all these gender roles, to feel all these stereotypes that even if they think they're not feeling, might come into play. And then the second thing is, why are authors and editors suggesting women as reviewers less? Maybe just the top 3 people they thought of were men, which might not be a bad thing. Sure, maybe those guys are all qualified, but there's probably a just as qualified woman or person of color who is also a researcher who could be recommended. And so, that might be playing into this skewed proportion. And then the second thing was, we started off this episode when we giving examples of taking notes at a meeting or organizing social work events. There are a lot of little tasks that women end up being placed with that, once again, one at a time might not be such a big deal. But when you actually add up the time that it takes you to do all these extra tasks, that puts a pretty heavy burden on a person. Add on to that women tend to be the primary caretakers of children and families, that women tend to be the people that are sweeping the floor and doing the dishes. If we're going by very strict stereotypes, women do end up being put with a lot more work, not just at work, but in the home. And so a lot of the women reviewers that were suggested also tended to turn down more of the reviewing work because they simply didn't have the time. And so I thought that was a pretty interesting study to bring in, because once again, it's not just on women to change these things. It's about all of us to kind of think about why is this happening and what can we do to help.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy, where it's people are perceiving women as the ones that do these tasks, that do certain tasks and don't do other tasks, and because that's what's being pushed and that's what's being pushed upon people, it ends up being true, and then people start seeing that and going, oh, well, that's what it's always been like, is
Sure.
women are doing this more instead of that.
And we talked about a conspiracy series, right? There's a lot of people that say the system, right? And other people roll their eyes and they're like, what is the system? But if we're talking about the system right now is that women are primary caretakers. Women are the ones that are working in the home. That's already working against them for trying to get this extra work at work. Or if they do get this extra work at work and then start not being the primary caretakers, then they're looked down upon for not being good mothers. And so, yes, this is a system. This is something that's already been set up where maybe you can't win either way unless our cultural perceptions change or something's got to give, you know?
Yeah.
Well, I liked you mentioning the unconscious bias, because that's a thing I think a lot of people don't think about or give credit to when it as often as it can be or as often as it plays a role in things, because it's a really good point to make that a lot of times it's not saying that anyone is, you know, nefariously trying to keep down those women, those pesky girls. You know, that's not what's typically going on. But like, if you buy into and you don't question that there's a pink girl aisle and a, you know, boy aisle full of action figures, Nerf guns, and Legos, and you never at one point go, so why can't one play with the other? Like, it's those little things of like, there's no reason for there to be, you know, different aisles. They're all just toys. They're all there for the same general purpose, but we've from a very early time start saying, well, no, this is the things this group does and the things this group does, and you just get programmed thinking that stuff, just like you would if you always see, you know, something fall. If it suddenly hovered in air, you'd be very surprised because you've come conditioned to expect gravity to work.
Yeah.
If society's been going one way, you've become conditioned to consider that the norm.
Yeah, and that actually is a pretty great segue into the second study I brought, which is titled Gender Differences and Recommendation Letters for Postdoctoral Fellowships in Geoscience. And so this study came out just last year in 2016. It came out in Nature Geoscience, and unconscious bias striking again. So these researchers studied recommendation letters that were submitted for applicants that were trying to get a job at, or trying to get a fellowship at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory between 2007 and 2012. And so these letters came from both male and female recommenders, and they were for both male and female applicants, and they were for applicants that were from over 50 different countries. Okay, so we've got a pretty good sample size and talent pool. So what the researchers found was that there was a pretty clear-cut difference in the vocabulary that people use in the recommendation letters for male versus female applicants. They were both positive, right? Because these are people who wanted their students or whoever they were recommending to get into the program. But unconscious bias, they were using different words to describe the people. And so for the male applicants, there were a lot more words like innovative, excellent scientist, more kind of proactive words, versus for the female applicants, it was like works well with others, or follows directions in lab, or things that still are positive, but it didn't have this sort of dynamic feeling about it, which maybe it doesn't seem like a big deal, but then again, when you're looking at all these really talented applicants who have almost the same kind of stats, and there's this one kind of feeling that's going to push you to one versus the other, it could really make a difference. And so when I was reading this study, was actually when I was doing research for the first full-length episode of my podcast, which was about Nettie Stevens, who was a 19th century mathematician. And I found the historic letters, like the actual letters that her mentors wrote for her, trying to help her get a position at a university. And they wanted her to get the position, so they were trying to be positive. And one of the things that they said was, she's a pretty good for a girl, pretty smart for a girl at math. And in, the 1880s, that was a compliment of the highest praise. Now, in retrospect, clearly laughable. But it's kind of these small things that are still playing into it that are still making a difference.
That's interesting. It's really interesting. A quick aside, because my brain relates everything back to film and movies. It made me think, especially in college, I used to make a habit just for the curiosity to see how it went in the conversation, that when I would be talking about movie characters, because I'm terrible with names, so I don't ever remember characters' names. Ocean's 11, I know each character. I don't remember any of their names. I know one of them is named Ocean. But I would make a habit of describing the characters by like what they did in the movie, and not by their sex or demographic. Not by the, because typically people are like, oh, the girl character or the non-white, whatever version of non-white they are, is how they denote those characters. And so I'd be like, well, the guy who was good with explosives, and it would be hilarious to me how long it took them to realize who I was talking about until I said the black guy.
Yep.
Or the whatever. And it's really interesting. And once again, you mentioning the vocabulary made me think about how often that is the case, to where, that's what people see first when they see a woman in science, is a woman.
And that informs,
and then they're like, oh, and she's a scientist.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's an interesting thing that comes up a lot in conversations like this, that and one of the differences between the demographics is that we have a habit of referring to men as scientists, and women as women scientists.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's that, and it's one of those things where it's not technically wrong. Like, yes, this is a scientist who is also a woman. It's the fact that we make that distinction that feeds into all these ways that we're treating different demographics differently, often unconsciously.
Right. So when you say scientists versus women scientists, it's showing already that women is not the default and it's something different. And so already you're like othering the women. So I actually this weekend was at the 100th anniversary opening for the Florida Museum of Natural History, where I work.
Cool.
And I was running a booth called Faces of the Museum. And so what we had done at an earlier event is we had made trading cards for people who worked at the museum, and visitors who were there could win the trading cards and try to collect them all, because we have them now at every event. But because I was in charge of making the trading cards, I said, let's do women who have been at the museum over the past 100 years. And so that's what we did. All the trading cards just so happened to be women in science. Now, if all the trading cards had just been dudes, I don't think too many people would have really noticed, like, oh, these are all dudes. It wouldn't have been dudes in science trading cards, right? It would have just been like, oh, they were probably just dudes doing science. So now as women in science, and a couple of people did ask, over the weekend, like, oh, why aren't there any guys? And I was like, oh, no, don't worry. Guys can be scientists, too. Yeah, there definitely have been guy scientists. Gotta let your gender stop you. We support everyone here.
There's been a few notable ones.
It was pretty funny to see some of the reactions, whereas, all of a sudden the all-women lineup really does strike a chord.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess that leads into this other phenomenon that can happen, where even when you're, where you have something like that, it's like, all right, these are all of our cards are men, or everyone that we've invited at this panel or something are men, and then looking at it and saying, well, we should have one woman. And that's sort of, even that I really liked the term you used, othering, where you have designated a certain demographic as the other demographic.
The outlier.
Yeah, so you get your token woman or your token person of color, and that leads into another issue that women in science or people of color in science have to deal with, which is only being called upon to be a part of a panel or to be a guest or something because they are talking about their experience as a woman or their experience as a person of color or any other minority. I'm here today because I love talking about this. I'm a women's studies major, and this episode is to bring awareness to these issues. I love that. But if this was the only thing I ever got called to talk about, I would not be happy.
Yeah.
And I know that definitely has happened to other women where there's a time and a place to want to be talking about these issues. Like we have a program called She's a Scientist at the museum, and it's for Girl Scouts. And they come, and it's all the scientists that are women at the museum help lead this day camp for them. That's awesome. I want to talk about my experiences as a woman, but I also am talking about my research to them because they want to learn about science. You know, sometimes there's festivals where, again, happens to be all women. Okay, yeah, let's talk about that. But we're still also talking about our research. And if you're only getting called to be a guest or a speaker and that's what they want to hear about rather than what you've been sweating, for 8 years over trying to get your PhD and whatever it may be, and you're asked, what is it like to be a person of color and blah, blah, blah. That's a really tired, really old question that, maybe they just don't want to talk about anymore.
I can see how being a woman and just always being asked what it's like to be a woman would get kind of old.
Yeah, and we should point out that, when we invite guests on the podcast, we've done it because of their expertise. Right?
Yeah.
We invited Sean because he's an expert preparator and Ethan studies primates. And the reason that Michelle was invited is not primarily because she's a woman, but because she is, this is Women in Paleontology, and she is a paleontologist who also studies women in science, though it's probably also worth pointing out that she is the first woman that we invited to be a guest on the podcast for the Women in Paleontology episode, which is perhaps revealing of some of our own unconscious bias as well.
Yeah,
so
and
listeners,
even if just
keep an
in
eye
our
on these
circle
guys.
of people. Keep us in check.
Let us know. We need to be inclusive as well.
Yeah. So there was one other study, actually, that I was debating whether or not to bring in, because to me it seems so obvious, but as you just mentioned, this is what I study, and so some of the things I've been staring at for 3 years are going to be brand new to other people. So let me just throw this last one out there. This study sent out resumes of applicants to people, the same exact resume. One of them had a male-sounding name, one of them had a female-sounding name. Guess which one got more responses? Guess which one got higher salary proposals?
Yeah. I don't wanna.
You don't want to?
Yeah.
The answer's going to be sad.
Yeah. Same exact application, and you still see that. And really, I don't know how you could get more clear-cut than that. That's what the bias is.
I'm glad you brought that one up, because we mentioned in in episode 17 that at this year's SVP meeting there was a Women in Paleontology luncheon.
Yeah.
And one of the presenters, Dr. Heather Metcalf, presented that study, the results of that study.
Oh, cool.
And for me, it was a really impactful moment. I don't know why that particular study stood out for me, but that it's such a clear-cut difference. It's such an obvious result. And what really struck me was that bias of preferentially giving treatment to male names over female names was present regardless of who it was reading the resumes. That this was something that men and women were equally doing to other women. And that this isn't, like Will was getting at before, it's not that, a lot of times this sort of discussion can come off like, men are nefarious and look at all the terrible things.
Yeah.
But sometimes that is absolutely true, but in general it's a societal issue. It is the word that comes up a lot is systemic. It's built in to the system.
Yeah.
Well, and I've heard similar things with the resumes been done. There's one and it was video online, so it must be true, but it was big CEO, or corporation managers or big time company bosses, and they were given like a few resumes, names blocked out, and given the time to read them, and then just asked to be like, all right, what's your first impression? And they were mostly from like college age or recent or near graduate age. And most of them were like, well, I probably wouldn't hire him, or I probably wouldn't hire her. They need a little more experience. I don't like the wording that they used here. That makes them feel a little wishy-washy, blah, 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 blah. And then they would peel the names off, and they had purposely gotten the resumes of like their friend's children or their niece or their
I remember that.
People that they knew, and it's like you just wrote off this person that you really care about purely just because of where they are in life, not because of who they are. And it's making that point that it's really easy to judge by a cover when you're looking at a piece of paper and going by your prejudgments.
There's also been another one. I don't have the name of the study. So the one we just talked about where it was male versus female students, that's from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So like PNAS. And that one came out in 2012. So it's a little bit older, but clearly the issue's still with us because I just brought 2 studies from the past few years. But there was another one that did the similar sort of thing. And it was a white sounding name versus an ethnic quote-unquote sounding name, which I hate that term because ethnic means anything not white, and so that makes white the default, but that's a whole nother conversation. But same
it's
thing
like the
happened
use of
there.
the term urban.
Inner city.
Inner city.
This goes many ways, and we're specifically talking about women in paleontology because, again, I'm a women's studies major, and that's what I focus on. But this is applicable to any minority, and not just in STEM. This is something that is a systemic issue. So, this can be extrapolated to many things.
Systemic.
Ha.
I'm sorry.
So we've talked a bit now about sort of the place of women in science and in paleontology and what some of the unique challenges are. But moving to paleo specifically, do we want to share the stories of some specific women in paleontology?
Yeah, I think that would be really fun. As I mentioned earlier, for listeners who don't know me, I specifically run a history podcast. I call it a feminist science history podcast because those are the 3 things we focus on. But if I had to pick just one descriptor, it's a history podcast. I like to talk about historical figures in STEM. And so when you guys first approached me with this, my first thought was, oh my God, we got to talk about Mary Anning. We got to talk about all these historical paleontologists that are so cool. Because when you ask someone to name, like, who are the founding people of paleontology, you get the classic white dudes like Richard Owen and blah, blah, blah. And so let me present to you some other historical figures that have contributed to our field that you ought to know about. And I will also add that the issues we were just talking about, those are kind of modern issues, right? We were talking about how the era of overt sexism is over. Well, we're jumping right back into that. So hold on to your butts, people.
Yes.
All right. Let's start with probably the most famous historical female paleontologist, Mary Anning. Now, Mary Anning was born in 1799 and lived until 1847. So we're talking the 19th century here. And she was a British fossil collector and amateur/avocational paleontologist. Now, the reason I say amateur/avocational, amateur paleontologist, I think, is the term that most people use. But I come from the Fossil Project at the Florida Museum of Natural History, and we work with a lot of non-paid paleontologists. And so these are people who maybe have a different job where they make most of their money, and they don't get paid for doing their paleontology research, but these people know so much more about paleontology than I do. And so the term amateur to me evokes someone who's just kind of like fumbling around, not knowing what they're doing. These guys are legit. So avocational is the term that I like to use. And so let's talk about why Mary Anning was an avocational paleontologist rather than a paid paleontologist back in ye old 19th century Britain.
Yes.
She was a very poor woman. She lived by the coast of Britain by some really fossiliferous cliffs, and she and her father would collect fossils from the cliffs to sell to make money. So in the process of collecting these fossils, she not only collected them and was like, oh, this is a pretty cool snake tongue / whatever tooth. She actually started trying to understand what these fossils were, had some really great ideas about them. And a lot of her clients were ye old white dude scientists like George Cuvier and Richard Owen. And so she actually got into really good discussions with them, explaining what she thought they were, explaining what she understood about paleontology as a science. And so she was not only, a person who sold fossils, but she was a colleague to these paleontologists. However, she was only a colleague in terms of the conversations they had because, as we discussed earlier, publishing is kind of the ultimate goal for scientists. Whether that's right or wrong, that's just how it is right now. That's how it was back then. And so if you want to publish, you need to have some money. If you want to be allowed into scientific lectures and present your thoughts, you need to be part of a society. And I don't have the exact stats right now, but if I remember correctly from the episode that I did, which I'll talk about in a little bit, the price to be a member of one of the societies in Britain where she could present her work was more than the money that she made in a year.
Wow.
So she was not going to get in there. And we've been talking about minorities in science and people who are at a disadvantage. And most of the time, of course, people think of women or ethnic minorities, but you know, people who don't have a lot of money, that's another barrier. That's another barrier to entry in science that we should also think about. People with disabilities. There's a lot more people that we've got to open our eyes to and maybe think about when we're planning stuff. But if you guys want to learn more about Mary Anning, listeners, or my lovely hosts that are here with me right now, the Femmes of STEM did do an episode on Mary Anning featuring two awesome paleontologists, Megan and Amy, who run a blog called Mary Anning's Revenge. And so the reason they called it Mary Anning's Revenge is because even though, as we said, Mary Anning was pretty smart, especially for being a poor, quote-unquote, uneducated woman, she didn't really get much credit for anything that she did. If you look at the casts or the fossils that she found, most of them don't have anything saying that Mary Anning was the person who found them and excavated and prepped and did all that work. And all of us being in the paleo world understand what it is like to have to collect fossils and the kind of skill that you need to prep fossils and the kind of skill you need to identify fossils. I know in my museum, the people who do all three of those things are, for the most part, separate people. And then you add on to that the people who study those fossils and interpret that. I mean, she was doing all of it. She was a pretty bright girl, but she didn't get credit for what she did until I think very recently. There are a couple of papers that have come out about her. I think her name is starting to get a little bit better known, but this is well over 100 years later. So Megan and Amy call themselves her Revenge and blog in her honor. And it's a really great blog, listeners. If you guys have not gone to Mary Anning's Revenge, you should go to now, unless you're at work, because it's definitely a not safe for work blog. It is very sarcastic. It is very sardonic. It is very up my alley type of humor. It's got all kinds of paleo news. It's got kind of irreverent musings on topics such as this about what is it like to be a woman in paleontology. I think they have a parody post where they write about what it's like to be a man in paleontology. So you should definitely check them out. And if you just want to learn more about Mary Anning and hear that discussion, that you can find that episode on the Femmes of STEM website as well.
Very cool.
Yeah. I have listened to that episode, actually, and I would highly recommend it. The three of you together did a great job talking about Mary Anning. For our listeners, of course, that episode is also a more mature discussion than we typically have on this podcast, so do be warned, but I would highly recommend it.
Yeah, so let's move on to a different paleontologist. Let's talk about Marie Stopes. She was born about 40 years after Mary Anning passed away. So she was born in 1880, passed away in 1958. She was also a British woman. She was an author, a paleobotanist, and a champion for women's rights. And so I'm sure you guys can understand why I thought she was an interesting person to talk about. So let's start by talking about her science work, because that's what's relevant to us on this Common Descent podcast. So she provided a lot of contributions to plant paleontology in terms of the Carboniferous. That's the era that she worked in. She was the first female academic on the faculty of the University of Manchester. So she went to the University of College at London to study botany. Specifically, she was studying plants from the Carboniferous period, so the Mississippian, Pennsylvanian. And so specifically, she was studying coal. In 1919, she published a paper coining 4 terms that our listeners may recognize because they are still, for the most part, in use today. So she coined the terms vitrion, which is the brilliant black and glossy kind of coal; durian, which is the hard and granular coal; clarion, which is the alternating light and dark layers; and then fusian, I hope I'm pronouncing these correctly, which is soft and crumbly. And so that's
interesting.
Yeah, that was her. That was a lady. They're still in use. If you ask anyone else, probably wouldn't know who came up with those terms, which maybe that's not a sex thing. I mean, I don't know who coined most of the terms that I'm using, but it's a fun thing to note. She ended up getting her graduate degree in Germany. She went to go get her PhD in botany also. And when she got her PhD, she became the first woman in Germany to earn a PhD in botany.
Cool.
And then at the same time, because she was British, became the youngest person in Britain to hold a doctorate, which at the time she was about 24. And I'm also 24. I don't have a doctorate, but listeners, if you want to feel even worse about yourself, before she even started her doctorate, when she was, I think, about 22, she had already published 2 papers on paleobotany. I definitely had not done that at 22. So, if you've been looking for a sign that you need to get back to your writing, this is it.
I am not 22 nor 24, so that does not make me feel good on either.
Yeah, pretty good for a woman, right?
Yeah, oh yeah, I mean, yeah.
For a girl. I bet it was all girl science.
She
Right.
publishes like a girl.
Yeah, before she was 22. That's what publishing like a girl is.
That's so
publishing
crazy.
like a guy is waiting until you're like 50. So.
I know, yeah, waiting until you got tenure.
So, in terms of paleontology, that's what she's remembered for. But if you Google Marie Stopes, or most people that would recognize her name would recognize her because she, as I said earlier, was a champion for women's rights. Specifically, she was really interested in contraception and providing birth control services for women. Now, I'll remind you that the time that she was doing this was the early 1900s, and this was not, right now it's still kind of taboo, so imagine this 100 years ago. It was really not okay. She did get persecuted by the church and by the government from time to time for advocating for these things. She actually published both a newsletter, which I think was called Birth Control News, and a book called Married Love, which I think came out in like 1918 or so. So around the time she was still doing paleobotany. So she's doing her paleo research, she's doing her women's rights stuff. Like, this girl's got her things going.
Dang.
And in her books, she gave explicit advice for how to do birth control, and really was the first person to bring this into like the public discourse, no longer being hush-hush about it, but saying, hey, we need to talk about these issues. And so that's super awesome. But if you guys put in like sound effects, this is when like the record scratch noise would come. Because as cool as that is, this was not all roses. One of the reasons that she was such a strong advocate for birth control was because she was also an equally strong advocate for eugenics. Yeah, that kind of eugenics.
Less good.
Not so great.
For sound effects, this is when the deflating balloon would come.
Yeah, or the wah, wah, wah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So try to publish early, kids, but
stay away from the eugenics. Yeah.
Hopefully one is not a symptom of the other. Is that what you're saying?
Try not to be a Nazi.
Yeah. Let's avoid
the general life rule.
Yeah, she attended the inaugural Congress of the Eugenics Society in 1912. She became a fellow of the society. She founded the Society for Constructive Birth Control and Racial Progress, which, if that doesn't tell you enough already. So this isn't just like allegations and people trying to like, ruin her name. This was legitimately what she was up to.
And it wasn't like something that she just would get into if she had enough drinks in her. It was something she was.
That was her shtick.
Yeah. So, not as good.
It's really interesting that you bring that up in talking about her because, and this kind of goes into some of the things we were talking about before, but it feels like usually when you have a list like this, these are women from history, it's kind of a best and the brightest list because the list is also, it's usually a defensive. It's usually, look, these are women who are worthy of praise and who did great things, and you rarely hear about the negatives, which is different when, if you talk about like Charles Darwin, people very often will bring up, here's all the great stuff he did, but also here's how he was a little bit racist because he was a rich white guy from the 1800s. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of refreshing to hear accounts of women from history, not just as people of note or people who were worthy, but as people.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this kind of goes into we're talking about this new age of sexism, right? So one of the things that affects this new age of sexism is unconscious bias, but there's this other kind of sexism called benevolent sexism. And so benevolent sexism is sexism that on the surface sounds kind of nice, like, let's only talk about good women. But what that ends up doing is framing women as these pure, holy angels that can do no wrong. And so then when real normal people who are women make a mistake, it's like, oh my God, I thought you were this pure, perfect paradigm of goodness, and how could you be doing this? And so it sets up these unrealistic standards. It's unrealistic. It's not real. And so when I'm talking about women in history, I'm not talking about idealized women. I'm just talking about women. I'm just talking about people. You know, people are good, people are bad, people are both.
Like you said at the beginning, you know, your podcast is a history podcast, and history should not, you know, shy away from one set of details or the other. It's the history of that person. You know, just because they were a successful woman doesn't mean we should ignore the fact that she didn't think certain people should breed, or whatever the case may be.
Yeah. And then benevolent sexism also ends up playing into these stereotypes that we were talking about earlier. You know, like saying women have motherly, nurturing instincts. And so they're trying to praise women by saying they're good. But then if you're saying women have motherly, nurturing instincts, that means that they have to be mothers. And so women who choose not to be mothers all of a sudden are wrong, or it just keeps playing unwomanly. What's wrong with you? Or women are more compassionate, or women are, there's just so many things. It's playing into these stereotypes. And so while on the surface, maybe it doesn't seem like the worst thing ever, it's still a form of sexism, and it's still a form that can set bad things in motion.
Yeah, you're still reinforcing this, like we were talking about with those studies early on, this unconscious framing of different groups of people as inevitably different.
Yeah.
And that even if it's in a good way, you're still segregating in your mind what you expect and what you push upon different people.
Yeah, 'cause even a seemingly positive stereotype is still a caricature of that group or that person. You know, I mean, because it happens with individuals where, you know, a person in your group becomes known as the this guy, or that, you know, whatever the whatever the feature is. You know, it's the guy who drinks, or the girl who is silly, or the blah blah blah, the one who never gets angry. And at some point, you're gonna have a moment where it's like, well, like, it's not all I do, guys. You know,
yes,
and that happens with groups.
Right, that's fine for a cartoon, but not for real people. Just like we were talking about earlier, when a paleontologist is only called upon to speak about her work or her experience as a woman in paleontology, she's like, wait, I'm also a researcher in paleontology, or a PhD in paleontology, or whatever it may be.
I'm also an expert.
Yeah, I also know a lot more about you do than XYZ. So
I happen to be a human.
I would love to see that moment. It's like, would you like to talk about women? No, I can tell you about shells, and I can tell you about bivalves.
Yep. Yeah, and that actually is happening already. I've heard that a lot from women that are just kind of like, I don't want to do this anymore. You know. So let's move on to another historical paleontologist.
Who's next?
So let's jump ahead a little bit in time. Well, actually, you know what? She was more or less a contemporary to Marie Stopes. We're talking about Tilly Edinger. She was born in 1897, passed away in 1967. And she was a German-American paleontologist who is probably most famous for being the founder of a new field of paleontology, paleoneurology.
Ooh.
So she was actually trained in zoology, geology, and paleontology. And it was in her doctoral dissertation, when she was studying the palate of a Mesozoic marine reptile, that she encountered this skull with a natural brain cast.
Cool.
And that kind of sparked an interest in her, got the gears going in her head. And eventually, after she got her PhD, she worked at the Geological Paleontological Institute at the University of Frankfurt, and then in the vertebrate paleontology section of the Sneckenberg Museum. And was able to continue her work, kind of looking into all these casts, until, if you heard the dates that I mentioned, you might realize that in the middle of her life, the Nazi Party rose to power. And so she was able to kind of get some work done, but after the events of Kristallnacht, she got out of there and basically had to leave behind all of the work that she was doing her whole life. She went to the British Museum of Natural History for a couple of years, but finally eventually went to Massachusetts to work at the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology, and that's where she would do most of her work for the rest of her life. And so once she was over there, she actually ended up being the first and only woman who attended the founding meeting of the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology.
That's really cool.
Whom the listeners should now be familiar with after the whole exciting episode a couple episodes ago. And so that founding meeting was in 1940. And then in 1963, she actually ended up being elected as the president of SVP.
Wow.
And she continued her work in paleoneurology for the rest of her life, published a couple of really important books like The Evolution of the Horse Brain, and just basically did this thing which I think is super cool and didn't even know about, that you can study the brains, right, like the squishy parts of old dead things just based on their casts. I mean, come on, girl. She founded an entire field of paleo.
That's really cool.
Very cool.
It's really interesting that you mentioned that she was, at the founding meeting, she was the only woman who was there, to compare to today. And we talked about SVP in episode 17 a bunch, that today there's actually a diversity committee on an SVP nowadays that are pushing for equal representation of different people, and that this sort of sign of how different the times have become from what they were, and this was just less than 100 years ago.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. And I would say it's awesome to think that we have the diversity committee, but it's also not as awesome to think that we need a diversity committee.
This is
right?
true.
We're moving forward, but we're not, we're not there. We're not there yet.
Progress is not the finish line.
Yes, this is true. I think it's really interesting to be going through these, sort of, not role models, but also just examples of women in paleontology, and the fact that you don't hear a lot about these people. Like I have a degree in this, right? You have a degree in this as well, and I don't know much. I've heard very little about a lot of these figures, and it ties into something that came up a lot when I was talking to people at SVP about diversity in paleontology and in STEM, which is something that I've been talking to a lot of people about recently, and it's conversations just like this one, which has been a really eye-opening experience for me to talk about this. It's like whenever you learn about any new thing, like last episode we talked about human evolution, and I started learning about it and going, wow, there's a lot here. This was very much the same thing.
Yeah.
And one theme that came up over and over again was this issue of representation. Mm-hmm. That it's not just that we're recognizing women or minorities or whoever is being underrepresented, it's also that we're making them visible. Mm-hmm. And I spoke with a lot of paleontologists who said that they sort of grew up not sure if they could be a paleontologist because they hadn't seen paleontologists who looked like them. And it was, I haven't seen women paleontologists in the books and the movies and the documentaries. None of them have tattoos. None of them are, are whatever color skin mine is, or whatever racial background or ethnic background I have. And it really is important to have these people, to show people, like, hey, look, there are women who do this. There are people in your demographic who do this, and you can do it too.
Especially for kids, that's a really big way in how they interact with the world is, hey, that looks like me. Why not that be me? That's a big part.
Yeah, we were talking about unconscious bias and the stereotyping starting from an early age. So if you see a brown female paleontologist as a scientist role model, then maybe even if you're not interested in being a scientist, you can relate to science in some way. And that makes you a little bit more connected to it. And you might not realize how big of an impact that has.
Yeah, it's not just a man's field, for men. It's a field for people.
And I think for me, one of the most depressing thoughts is not just the impact it has on little kids to seed that preconception that this isn't a field that they can join. But even worse than that is that it seeds that thought in their parents.
Yeah. Yeah.
That mom says, well, I've never seen a female paleontologist, so I'm not going to encourage you to pursue that, or I'm going to push you to do something different.
Yeah.
And that, unconscious bias comes from all directions.
Yeah.
That's really depressing.
So we're talking about representation and like, why does this matter? And I think it's important to think about, and this is something that I talk a lot about in my podcast, is about why we don't hear about historical women scientists.
Yeah.
A lot of the times the answers I get or the comments I get from people is that, well, there just weren't that many women doing science before the 20th century or before the 1950s or the 1980s or whatever period in time you want to pick. Or there weren't people of color because these people in this country didn't really do science. And so, my God, the kind of sexist and racist comments I've gotten are ridiculous, which, again, people probably not thinking that they're being racist or sexist because just in their history classes, they never heard about it. So they assume these people or these genders didn't do science.
Yeah, they think they're being factual, but...
They think they're being factual, right. But... Okay, so let's think about history. Let's think about who was writing history, who was recording history, and what was being deemed worthy of recording. If we're talking about the earth sciences and paleontology, well, let's consider geology didn't really start until like the 18th century, right? And the word paleontology didn't actually, it's like first recorded in the early 19th century. And so this is a relatively recent field, if we're talking about modern geology and paleontology. And so just in general, the people who could do this kind of work tended to be people who had money, right? Because mostly science was more of a hobby for wealthy people who had the time to like delve into these things. We talked about this a little bit with Mary Anning. The reason she was doing science was because she needed to find fossils to make a living and to survive.
She needed to sell seashells by the seashore.
Yeah.
She needed to sell seashells by the seashore. But she still couldn't get into like science because she couldn't afford to be part of these societies. She didn't have the time to take off from work and go to these lectures, etc. And so the only kind of people, men or women, that could really be scientists were wealthy. And then the only way that women could really get into science was to be assistants, right? Quote unquote. And so I say quote unquote because a lot of these assistants were often wives or daughters or siblings of these wealthy male scientists. And so what they did was help them with their science, not just by carrying the pickaxe or giving them bags, but really participating with their counterparts. And so because as a woman, you couldn't really be part of a society, you were allowed at lectures, but you weren't allowed to be part of a society. We're talking again about the 18th and 19th centuries. Well, the person whose name was going to go on that paper was the man
who showed up.
And so when you look back at history, whose name is there? The man's name, and the other names get lost to time. Charles Lyell, the geologist, he's one of our more famous founding fathers. Well, his wife, Mary Lyell, was one of the assistants who did the same amount of work. And so there are some notebooks and some notes that you can look back at and see, who was writing what. And can we tell who was actually coming up with the ideas and who was writing them down? No, a lot of these things are lost to us. Not just in geology, not just in earth sciences, but a lot of history. So when you're looking back at history and saying, well, I only see a man's name, writing in paleontology, that's the only thing that was recorded. And that's like one brief little glimpse that might not be the whole story. And so I think that's also really important to consider when you're talking about representation or what is the history of these fields. Something that I like to say a lot in my podcast, I wouldn't say our tagline, but something we like to repeat is that women have always been a part of the past, but they haven't always been a part of history. Yeah. Because history is a record that is chosen to be written down by someone. Yeah. And at the time, women didn't matter, so why would you record them doing these things?
I love that sentence.
Yeah,
it's such a great encapsulation of how... it's like when they say history is written by the victors.
Yeah.
Right? So, and it seems like the history of science is littered with examples of women who helped to come up with some really pinnacle ideas who didn't get the credit. like,
Yeah.
famously
Oh my
in
God.
biology, right? Rosalind Franklin, who was in the lab with Watson and Crick discovering DNA, but didn't get her name put out there. Or
Yeah.
Marie
Yeah.
Tharp is another example whose discoveries were a major part of introducing the now ubiquitous theory of plate tectonics that
Yeah.
underlies all of geology. And those are women who weren't on the papers or weren't in the
not
history
acknowledged.
books.
I think a lot of
Right.
people feel like when this gets mentioned that we're saying the guy's name should be erased and replaced, but it's not that. Where there should be a co-authorship,
Yes, right.
There's
or even
a
a
single
first
author.
authorship.
Yeah.
or
In
either
a
a
lot of
first
those
authorship,
cases.
which is really poignant because today, if your name was left off of paper, you wouldn't ever work with that person again.
Yeah, no, that's a huge deal.
That's a
And
huge
scientists
deal
get
in
into
scientific community.
Yeah, that can break entire relationships if there's a not getting credit for the work you put into a study is a huge affront.
Cool, because that's the record of you being a scientist,
Yep.
which is what we're talking
and it was
about.
the norm for women in science for a long time to
Yeah.
not get that credit.
Yeah.
Yeah, so while we're talking about credit, should we talk about some cool modern projects
Yes, please.
by paleontologists who we think would be relevant to
Absolutely.
this episode?
So, what are some of some great resources regarding modern women in paleo?
What's going on nowadays?
There are some really cool projects. Let's start with the Bearded Lady.
Yeah.
This is a US-based documentary featuring women in various careers, various levels of various careers in paleontology. And I think, David, you've actually seen the trailer recently. Do you want to kind of explain what that's
Sure,
about?
I did. Yeah, I watched the trailer as part of preparing for this episode, and I had heard about it and never really delved into figuring out what it was about entirely. But based on the trailer, it's a documentary, like you said, depicting women in paleontology and in in the lab, in the field, all the different places that a woman can be a paleontologist. The whole beard theme there is this really poignant point that they make that the image you always see of paleontologists is this sort of rugged, messy gentleman out in the Badlands or somewhere with this big, bushy paleontologist beard.
Mm-hmm.
And it fills this stereotypical view of a paleontologist. And the point that the women in the documentary are making, or one of the points they're making, is women can be just as successful at field work, just as rugged, just as messy, just as down in the dirt, just as hands-on. All the same things that these men are doing, they just don't have a beard. And if you slap the beard on, there is no distinction between what the women are doing and what the men are doing.
And I love that because that was a question that I would often get. I've shaved down now, but back when I had my big bushy beard and was working at the museum, guests all the time would go, "So is a beard required to work here?" Because they'd be looking at Sean and Wally and me, who all had, a decent amount of facial hair, and it's enough to be a dad joke.
Yeah, and it's a harmless little joke, but that harmless little joke is part of a greater stereotype
identity
of what people expect to see.
Yeah. So another cool project, or actually a cool pair of projects that are specifically focused on the history of women in paleontology are Trailblazers, which is UK-based, and Daring to Dig. So Trailblazers is not just paleontology, but women in all kinds of earth science. People that might use a trowel to dig in the field. So archaeologists, paleontologists, earth scientists, geologists. That one's super cool. So their website, you should definitely check out because they feature historical figures, but also modern day women. And the coolest way that they do this is that part of their project, which I think is a traveling exhibit, but part of their project was to do a photo shoot. And in the photo shoot, they wanted to recreate portraits of like Mary Anning and Leakey and all these really cool historical figures, but they didn't just hire models. They hired actual women in those fields today to portray their foremothers, if you will, from those fields. And they're just so cool. It's a really cool website. They've got, just like couple paragraph descriptions of the woman's life that you can then look into later. And the same thing with the Daring to Dig project. That one is US based, and so it's specifically United States women in earth science and paleontology. And that one's a traveling exhibit being created by the Paleontological Research Institute, it's a PRI. And that one's, I think, still a work in progress. But you can go to their website and they have all the bios that they've created of the past and current women in paleo right now. So that one's really cool.
And we'll include links to all these in our standard blog post that when we publish up the episode, we'll put, you can follow the links and little descriptions in our blog post. Also, and this needs to be said, I think, I need to say it, huge props to whoever came up with the name Trowel Blazers.
Yes.
My goodness, I'm jealous. I am so jealous. That's one of those things that I read and go, I wish that I wasn't as stupid as I am and didn't think of that first. Oh, that's so good.
Yeah, that was pretty solid. So, if you want to learn a little bit more about like women in paleo, also one of the resources that I've used a lot is this blog called Letters from Gondwana, and that one's written by Fernanda Castro. And she writes about all kinds of paleo news and paleo stuff, but she also has a pretty solid recurring series of blog posts that feature historical women in paleo.
Cool.
So if you want to learn more about Marie Stopes or people like the Nuam Courtois, which if you don't know who they are, I didn't either until she wrote about them. I don't know how she's finding all these ladies because part of my job is to find historical women in STEM. But she's got it down. So if you want some like good short blog posts to read about historical paleontologists, go check out her blog. And then, while I'm on the subject of blogs, once again, I'm going to promote my girls, Megan and Amy from Mary Anning's Revenge. So funny, so irreverent, so not safe for work. Do yourself a favor and check it out. It's hilarious.
One of those women actually joined a super special secret project that we did around SVP time, which we will talk about a little bit later. So I got to meet Amy as
teaser.
Part of... Yes, a little teaser, foreshadowing. There's a special thing coming up. Stay tuned to the end of the episode
super special.
for the announcement of a super secret thing that involves Amy of Mary Anning's Revenge, at least in part.
Taking pointers from the MCU.
This is a trailer for the
This
end
is
of
the
the
teaser
episode.
for the trailer.
So then on a completely different note, something that's totally safe for work and your children is a upcoming children's book called She Found Fossils. It's a kid's book about women in paleontology, and it was created by Dr. Eugenia Gold, and it's going to be published both in English and Spanish, which is pretty cool. It was actually funded on Kickstarter, which is a really cool thing. I think the funding period already closed, but you can go visit the Kickstarter to see what it's all about, to learn where you can order the book eventually. And I was super excited to fund this project. I did it right away, and I will point out that she did on Twitter send out a call for modern women in paleo who might want to be featured in her book. So
Cool.
Check it out, because maybe some of your friends or colleagues might be featured there. Who knows?
Very cool.
Neat.
That's excellent. Those are all great resources. And like I said, we'll put all those on the blog post.
Yeah.
This whole episode, we've been talking about various facets of women's role in paleontology, and there's a whole lot more to talk about in this. But even this specific topic ties into the much larger subject of general diversity in paleontology and in science in general. And I think it's really telling that we haven't been able to make it through any of our discussions so far here without also linking these issues to issues of people of color and people in other, of people in poverty and other demographics that suffer from similar issues. And I think that this all ties into this discussion of what we can do to improve acknowledgement and representation for all people in a field of science and in any field, and specifically in this episode in paleontology. So my next question, I guess, for our guest expert is where do we go? What are the best ways for us to improve on the state of things where we are now?
Yeah. So let's kind of bring it back to what are the issues, right? What are the things that we need to improve on? And one of the first things we talked about was unconscious bias, which affects everyone. And so the first step to defeating unconscious bias is admitting you have unconscious bias. And so there's this really great website. I can't remember the name of it. It's by a university. There's a test. I think it's the implicit bias
it's
test.
Project Implicit.
Project Implicit. There you go. It's a university-run website, and it does exactly what it sounds like. It gives you this test where you go into it saying, like, I'm not racist, I'm not sexist, I'm fine, this is fine. And then you get it back, and you're like, oh, that is not quite what I expected to see. And fair warning, it's going to kind of hurt to do this one. That's the whole thing about unconscious bias, right? You don't realize quite all these things that you might be feeling inside. Is it your fault? Maybe yes, maybe no. This is part of the way that we've been conditioned, but at the same time, we're all adults here, and it's time for us to, acknowledge these biases that we have and do something about them. And so recognizing that these are issues, kind of figuring out and calling yourself out when these issues are happening is a really important step, right? Not leaving the burden of change on the underrepresented is so important, because as we were talking about, women are so often asked, what is it like to be a woman in science, and what can you do to change, and blah, like, right, when we have to save all these experiences and write a research paper about it and publish in multiple journals that, hey, guess what, there's still sexism and we're still dealing with it, can anyone help us out? Hello like, that's tiring. And so we need other people to step up to the plate and help us. If you're a person who has privilege or power by any means, I mean, I'm a queer Latinx woman of color scientist, right? And so that puts me at a disadvantage. But at the same time, I have financial stability to the point where I have a roof over my head every night, and I can walk on my own 2 feet. And so I have privileges of my own, and I'm going to use those to help the people who don't. And so this is not just saying, like, if you're a white male, although if you are, guys, I'm really talking to you, we need you to step up to the plate. But, everyone has a way in which they can help someone else. And so recognize your bias and then act against your bias and act on the privilege that you have. And so I kind of wanted to turn this back on you guys, because you've been asking me, right, as a queer Latinx woman of color, what can you tell us about women in science, and what can we do? So from what we've talked about, right, we've been kind of preparing this episode for, I'd say, about a month now, talking back and forth, floating ideas. What would you say that you could do to improve these issues?
I liked both those points, because I think those are things that so often get ignored. Like, no one likes to admit that they have a flaw they don't like. It's fine to be like, I stay up too late. That's a flaw, but it's not one that's dislikable. It's hard to be like, okay, yeah, I can be a little sexist sometimes when it comes to these attributes. Like, that's not a fun thing to bring up in conversation, but it's, and I was glad that you admitted that. It's like, regardless of who takes that test, probably going to be a little surprised at the results. It's like saying I don't have an ego. You probably do.
You have to say that.
Yeah, and that's.
Look,
I think that really is.
But if you're fabulous and you're fabulous, that's
that's true.
Like me, I'm fabulous, and I know it.
You're fabulous. Can
but
confirm.
I think that is a big part of it.
Michelle is fabulous.
Yes. It's just that trying to take that first step to just acknowledge, just acknowledging that there is a difference for those people who are not the majority of whatever the field or the setting is. In paleontology, women are one of the minorities, so it is different. It's not that's not just something that happened by random chance.
And I think for me, and I mentioned that, we've been working on this with Michelle, and I was talking to a bunch of people about this at SVP. One of the things that I have found to be really, really important, because, like Will's saying, it's not comfortable to talk about these things, especially if you're part of the problem. And in this case, we're all part of the problem.
Yeah.
Some of us more than others, whether we mean to be or not. And I think that it's so important just to talk about it, and more importantly, to listen.
Yes.
The conversations that I have had just coming out of, asking a question or two over the past couple months have been really telling for me. And even little things like when we were coming up with, so we're going to talk about this super special diversity and paleontology project thing here in a little bit, but it involved asking people questions about diversity in paleontology.
Yeah.
And we turned to Michelle and we said, hey, Michelle, what are some good questions? And Michelle said, I'll tell you what's not a good question. And what's not a good question is, what's it like to be a woman in paleontology? For all the reasons that you've already explained, that it's this focusing, you're a woman, talk about being a woman instead of talking about
tell us about
other
the issue.
issues. And it was, you said that, and I went, huh, well, there goes my first thought.
Erase.
Because I wouldn't even have thought about that. I wouldn't even have considered that was somehow an issue, a question that is overdone, because I'm looking at this from the perspective of a person who's never really looked at it. And, to listen and to hear people. And I had this moment not too long ago, in talking about these sorts of things where, you hear about these, what might be written off as complaints from, I experienced sexism in the workplace, or I was not chosen for this job because I feel like I'm being discriminated against because of my gender or because of other reasons. And from the outside, it's kind of easy to say, well, there's other explanations and there's other reasons. But like Michelle said, when you hear it over and over again, if you're listening, and I had a moment not too long ago where I looked back and went, the people I'm hearing this from are not unreliable, silly people. Like, these are intelligent, self-aware human beings. And if I listen to what they're saying, like, of course I would listen to them. Just like I would listen to them saying anything else. Why would I write that off as being not a big deal unless I'm doing it because I'm acting on unconscious bias of my own? And that's a hard thing to do. Yeah, and it is. It's 100%. I was at SVP, and I sat down at the student roundtable, had a table this year for women in paleontology, and I sat down next to Ashley Morehart, who's on the diversity committee, and I was on a table that was, when I sat down, entirely populated by women, and I was the only man there sitting there going, I don't know what to say.
Mm-hmm. You don't need to say anything. You guys always get to talk. It's your time to listen.
Yes, that is a very good point.
Yeah.
And step out of your comfort zone and talk to people and listen to what they have to say is such an important way to change your perspective.
Well, that lack of reference is a big part of it. For a lot of people, I saw a really, really great newspaper comic the other day. It may have been on Facebook. It may have been on the bulletin board at work. I don't remember. But it was two bald eagles talking to each other. So probably some political underlying there. But that's not what I'm reading into. Two bald eagles talking. And one of them looked up to the other and goes, "Hey, do you think Mr. Owl's dangerous?" And the other one goes, "No, I've never felt threatened by Mr. Owl." And he goes, "Okay, yeah, me neither." And he goes, "Why do you ask?" And he goes, it was a conversation I was having earlier, but, I don't know what Mr. Mouse is talking about." And it's kind of that, it's really hard. It's really hard to actually understand what's going on with, women or whatever other demographic within science or another field when you aren't that demographic, So it's hard to put yourself in the shoes unless you actively try to. You're not just going to default to that mindset if that's not what you're experiencing. You're going to default to your experience. And the only way you're going to get there is by listening, talking, and paying attention. What you were saying earlier about, just kind of, doing a check on yourself, looking at yourself and or looking at things, even just a movie you watch and going, why did the female character need to be wearing tight pants in that scene?
Or no pants.
Yeah, exactly. Like, why was that necessary? None of the guys are wearing that.
All the protagonists, just white male dudes, It's once you start looking, it's like, oh, damn, it's everywhere. So we've been saying
little steps toward big things.
So we've been saying, look at yourself, recognize, pay attention, but let's move it one step further and also say that action is necessary, right? Like the first step, recognize and listen, but action. So what kind of action can people take? There's this really great pledge that I've seen, and I'll find it and share it with you guys, that is a pledge that says, I will not agree to be on panels, for example, that are just all male, and I would take it a step further and say all white males for conferences. And we were talking about reviewers. We could be thinking about seminar series. And, if we have listeners like myself, I'm a grad student. I'm, for the most part, not going on panels, but I listen to panels. And so if I see a panel that is all white dudes, I might think about contacting whoever organized the panel, the organization, or the conference and say, hey, I definitely know that there's women in paleontology that are just as qualified as these guys. But then there's also this issue that we were talking about earlier, which is the burden of change falling on the minorities, right? Because we're the ones who see it. Yes. We're the ones that want to change it. But let's think about women, for example. We're talking about stereotypes. There's the stereotypes of women as being emotional and whiny and unstable. And so if it's only one woman in the department going up to the chair who maybe is not so into looking at these issues, and that woman starts getting ostracized and they start seeing her as whiny or, doesn't work well with the team or whatever, that's a big problem. Whereas if we're talking earlier about privilege and what can you do with what you've been given, well, if you guys were the ones who went up to that panel, if it's more than one person, and if it's people who already have a platform from which to talk, that can make a lot of difference. And so that's one of the things that I would challenge you and your listeners to think about, right? We were talking about recognize your bias and try to see these issues when they come up, but then also do something about them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's not easy. Mm-mm. And we know that, that's asking a lot of ourselves and of other people that we're recommending this to. And, I mentioned earlier the Women in Paleo luncheon at SVP, which was recorded. And so you can find it online. And we'll put a link to that in the blog post, too, in case people want to see the speakers. But there was an audience member who came up at the end of that and shared her experience trying to do exactly what Michelle is just describing, of noticing that there was a panel and it was all dudes. And she went up to the people in charge and said, hey, maybe there are women you could have invited, or why didn't you, right? Making people aware of their own biases. The people that didn't listen to this discussion or that don't listen to Michelle's podcast, right? Mm-hmm. Making them aware. And, if I remember her, I don't want to mischaracterize her experience, so you can go look at it yourself. But, essentially it didn't go very well, right? People are not always open to hearing this. And it can be a challenge, but that's no reason not to add your voice because, right, power in numbers. We add more voices, especially, like Michelle was saying, we're in a society where, unfortunately, a person who is not part of a minority demographic is more likely to be listened to in a lot of cases. So use that to your advantage if you have that.
Yeah, like you said, it's definitely, it's not always an easy thing to do, mostly just because it can be very awkward.
Yeah.
But that's not saying it's not awkward for the women that are trying to do it.
Yes. I was trying to figure out how to insert that. But you got it.
It is awkward, period. We, and the people who not being affected typically by the issue directly are just not driven to by personal experience because we're not being tamped down or ignored or given a difficult time to be a scientist. So it takes an extra little step to get past that awkwardness and take the awareness to go, yeah, you know what, I agree, and I'm not just going to tell you that I agree with you. I'm going to tell someone else that I agree with you.
Yes.
It's an extra step, but yeah, it's a socially awkward one, but it's a socially awkward for everyone, so it still needs to be taken.
Absolutely.
So on that note, should we transition to the super secret, super special extra bonus episode that we've mentioned?
Bonus. Yes. So
sprinkles on top.
Here's, how I was saying that if you talk about it and you listen and you have discussions, wonderful things happen. Well, when we reached out to Michelle, originally the only thing that we planned was, hey, come on our podcast and talk about women in paleontology, because it was a request by one of our listeners. But Michelle came up with this incredible suggestion, because I was going to be at SVP, to see if we can get some little mini interviews with some people around SVP. And originally, Michelle, you suggested it as getting sound bites. Like maybe if I get a couple of people to make little sound bites that we can squeeze into the episode. But I didn't get a couple of people. I got 16. Because turns out people want to talk about this.
Weird.
And so, yeah. And so we are going to be releasing, along with this episode, a compilation of 16 different paleontologists that I spoke to at the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology. Women, men, older paleontologists, younger paleontologists, all different backgrounds, sharing their thoughts on this question of diversity in paleontology, where we're at, what we need to do, why it's important. And we're going to, like I said, we'll put it out alongside this episode. I would highly recommend listening to it, because talking to these people, and I hope that I'm not saying this so much that I'm oversaturating this impression that I'm trying to give.
You're overhyping it.
I've been going to SVP for 8 or 9 years, and talking to these people about this issue was probably the most personally impactful experience that I have had at SVP. It was so wonderful and so touching to hear these different people express their personal experiences and their personal viewpoints and their hopes and dreams in a lot of cases for what the field that they love should and hopefully will continue to aim towards being.
Yeah, and I'd like to add that we talked about tokenization and being that, the token woman talking about blah, blah, blah. And I'd really like to make clear that the opinions that I've presented today, the issues that I'm talking about, these are from my point of view. This is what I feel. I'm trying to incorporate things I've heard from my colleagues and my friends, but making this very clear, this is Michelle Barboza-Ramirez's take on these issues that are going on. And so that's one of the really big reasons that I suggested we talk to other people, because this doesn't just affect me. I'm not the representative of women in paleo. I'm not the representative of the LGBTQ community. I'm not the representative of the people of color. I'm just a perspective. And so let's hear everyone else's perspectives.
You're not the only voice, and no one person is. Mm-hmm. There's plenty of voices, and they all have slightly different stories and takes on it. And the more you listen to, the bigger picture you get.
Yeah. And we have spent lots of time in this episode recommending things. We've recommended blogs, and we've recommended actions, and we've recommended listening to this other compilation. Other people's
blog.
Voices.
Super secret, super special.
I would like to reiterate that we would highly recommend, if you are interested in any portion of this episode, that you check out the podcast of a good friend of ours, Michelle. Michelle, would you like to tell the listeners where they can find you?
Sure. So if you guys want to hear more about the history of STEM, specifically the untold histories of a lot of really cool scientists who, oh my gosh, happen to be women, and especially women of color, you should definitely check out the Femmes of STEM podcast. You can find us at femmesofstem.com. That's FEMMESOFSTEM.com. I also have social media accounts for the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all at Femmes of STEM. And if you just want to specifically hear my ramblings, which is a mixture of interest in science communication, diversity in STEM, and museum life, which is what I'm all about, then you can follow me at Latinx Scientist at Twitter. So that's LITINX Scientist. Or you can follow me on Instagram at Michelle M. Barboza. That's Barboza with a Z. And I'm sure my good friends will put all of those links online for you guys, because you probably forgot the first one already.
That will all be on the blog. We'll put it on our social media as well. Like we say at the end of every episode, you can find us on Twitter, Facebook, Patreon, all different places. We take comments, we take questions, we take suggestions for other episode topics.
Speaking of which, this episode was based on a suggestion, and I would like to make a shout out to that listener who suggested it, because you got me on the show.
Yes, that was Matthew on Facebook.
Thanks, Matt.
Also, if you're not already a patron of this episode, you should, because we're about to record a super secret, super special After Talk episode only available to Patreon subscribers, which means that I have to subscribe now too, because I want to hear our ramblings.
What? This is so unexpected. I never even thought about that.
That's true, actually. Our patrons get access to bonus audio content.
Yeah.
None of the educational. All the educational stuff is free, but we record After Chat, which is usually just me and Will nonsensing for an extra 10-15 minutes. But this time we're going to be joined by Michelle, so
A third
extra
person's
special.
worth of nonsensing.
And I don't have to censor myself in this one, guys.
Michelle's been trying very hard this whole episode.
She's been doing very well this whole episode.
Thank you, thank you.
Mostly. The editing, does a very good job. Like I said, we take comments, we take questions, we take suggestions for episode topics. This time I will add that in addition, if you have follow-up questions, in addition to contacting us at the Common Descent podcast, you should consider contacting Michelle on social media, at her website with her podcast, because I'm sure she would love to take your questions about this topic.
Yeah, let's keep this conversation going, guys.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, as we wrap up, big thanks to all of our listeners for listening to this episode. Big thanks again to Matthew for making this suggestion and for inspiring what has been, I think, and I hope, a fantastic conversation.
I've enjoyed it.
And a huge thanks, wherever you are out there in the world, applause for our guest, Michelle. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode.
De nada, de
It was
nada.
awesome.
And gracias for inviting me on.
Yeah, and if our listeners, if you really liked it, if you liked hearing this conversation, you want to hear more about it, let us know. Maybe we'll bring Michelle back, or maybe we'll bring on somebody else. Who knows? We'll continue the conversation.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. As is always the case, we release new episodes every fortnight, usually one at a time, usually normal length. We'll see. But next time, 2 weeks from now, we will release another episode.
Eventually we'll release a normal length one again.
Eventually we'll take a break.
What
from
is
being crazy.
normal? What is lame?
Yeah, well,
That's
we're defining
the
it.
theme of this episode.
That's true. There's no other episode. They're
Yeah,
all
who
episodes.
decided
Yes.
episodes needed to be an hour? Question the system. It's a conspiracy.
Dear listeners, keep listening, keep learning, be proactive, check yourselves, check each other.
Before you wreck yourself.
Yes.
And please join us next time on the Common Descent podcast. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thanks for listening to the Common Descent podcast. For more from us, you can follow us on the Common Descent podcast Twitter account, Facebook page, or on our WordPress blog where we post additional cool stuff for each episode. The song you're hearing is called On the Origin of Species by Protodome. You can find this and other video game remix music at ocremix.org. Thanks again for listening. We hope to see you next time.